By the end of January 1945, Berlin was immersed in an atmosphere of emotional collapse and total chaos. Air raid sirens went off without fail twice a night, at 8 and then again at 11. The displaced people arriving from the east brought horrifying stories of what was happening at the hands of the Red Army. Meanwhile, Hungary, until then a firm Axis ally in the Balkans, seemed to have definitively changed sides by supporting the Soviet Union. News of the swift advance of Soviet forces was spreading panic, and the population already assumed that the Eastern Front was irreversibly collapsing. Among common soldiers, there was hope that the Soviets would only execute officers and SS men, while civil servants and workers tried to convince themselves that they would not be victims of reprisals by the invader. The most reliable information about the state of the Western Front didn't come from official sources, but circulated informally thanks to railway personnel. These workers were often better informed about enemy movements than the high command itself. As the war progressed, more and more German citizens chose to take the risk of secretly listening to BBC broadcasts, even though a simple report from a neighbor to the Gestapo could send them directly to a concentration camp. Despite this, many fervent followers of Hitler and Goebbels continued to blindly believe the version spread by the Ministry of Propaganda, known as the Promi. Urban transportation remained paralyzed, forcing workers to navigate rubble daily to get to their jobs. Some managed to improvise shelters in apartments close to their workplaces to avoid commuting. The sleeping bag became as essential as the coat itself, and portable beds multiplied in the homes of those hosting relatives or acquaintances fleeing from the east or who had lost their homes after the bombings in the capital. Among those with contacts or resources, escape plans from Berlin began to circulate, driven by disturbing stories of property owners summarily executed by Soviet troops in East Prussia. For many, it became clear that the landowning nobility and the military elites were now priority targets of the Red Army, which, in its rhetoric, equated the elimination of National Socialism with the destruction of the old Junker power. Those trying to leave Berlin had to take extreme precautions, as Goebbels had warned that leaving without authorization would be treated as an act of treason. To legally leave, one needed a safe conduct pass, which was only granted if the person could justify that their work outside the city was deemed essential. Even those with legitimate reasons were quietly advised by their colleagues, "Don't come back. Stay where you're going." Most people fantasized about finding refuge in some village far from the conflict, where farms still had food reserves. Some, in desperation, began considering the option of obtaining false documents, which made foreign diplomats unexpectedly popular. Ministerial workers, for their part, were relocated to the south in the following weeks, benefiting from their positions. The regime of fear. The most feared threat for many was the wave of executions ordered by Himmler and carried out by the SS. On January 23rd, as Soviet forces crossed the eastern borders of the Reich, several opponents involved in the July 20th plot were executed at Plötzensee. Among them were Count Helmuth von Moltke, Eugen Boltz, and Erwin Planck, son of the famous physicist Max Planck. In that climate of repression, Goebbels launched a new slogan: "We will win because we must win." For those who did not follow the Nazi ideology, this slogan only provoked despair and rejection, although most citizens didn't dare question it. Even when defeat seemed inevitable, many clung to the idea of a final victory, more out of fear and resignation than conviction. Goebbels' propaganda machine, designed to eliminate all notion of an alternative, had managed to impose the illusion that there was no other possible destiny for Germany than to fight to the last breath. Goebbels, in his dual role as Minister of Propaganda and Reich Commissioner for the Defense of Berlin, moved about with ease and enthusiasm as the leading spokesperson for total war. He kept appearing at public events, inspecting Volkssturm ranks, giving fiery speeches, and making propagandistic visits to the troops, reinforcing his image as an active leader. Meanwhile, Hitler's figure became increasingly distant to the population. His absence in the newsreels was evident, and the last time many had heard him was in his radio message on January 30th, commemorating the 12th anniversary of the Nazi regime. However, his voice no longer inspired fear or determination. It sounded muted, unrecognizable. This fueled a wave of rumors claiming he was dead or had been captured. The regime never clarified whether the Führer was at his Berchtesgaden retreat or still hiding in Berlin. Meanwhile, Goebbels, present in the city and among the civilians suffering the effects of the bombings, was reinforcing his popularity. Hitler, in contrast, seemed to be avoiding his devastated capital, refusing even to contemplate the disaster it had become. The tragedy of Breslau. The brutal fate awaiting German civilians was just beginning, and in places like Breslau, the tragedy reached unbearable levels. With the unstoppable advance of the Red Army and the tanks of General Leschenko, the city was plunged in panic. Although it's not known for certain whether some refugees died aboard sunken ships during the escape, what is documented is the suffering of thousands of women and children who tried to flee on foot in the middle of winter. Men who had not yet been enlisted into the Wehrmacht were mobilized by the Volkssturm to defend the city, leaving their families behind. Thus, mothers were left alone, driven by desperation, while loudspeakers patrolled the streets, urging people to evacuate immediately. Those who failed to board the overcrowded trains had to set off on foot with their children in their arms, relying on promises of aid from the NSV, the Nazi Party's welfare organization. They carried backpacks with powdered milk, blankets, and thermoses filled with hot milk, trying to protect their babies from the extreme cold. But upon reaching the outskirts of the city, the reality was devastating. They were alone. Hardly any vehicles were running, and most had to walk along snow-covered roads. Exhausted, mothers ended up abandoning their baby carriages and carrying their children directly in their arms. The freezing wind turned the contents of the thermoses into icy liquid, and feeding the infants became a desperate task. Some tried to breastfeed in sheds or behind walls, any shelter from the wind. But the cold was relentless. Milk would no longer flow, and mothers' bodies began to lose heat at an alarming rate. Some suffered frostbite on their breasts. In a letter sent by a young mother to her own mother, she anguishedly described how her child died of hypothermia, and how other women devastated wept while holding the lifeless bodies of their babies. Along the roads were silent figures, mothers sitting in the snow with small children around them, trembling, not knowing whether her mother was still alive or had died from exhaustion and cold. In such extreme conditions, the difference between fainting and dying became imperceptible. This was not an evacuation. It was the beginning of a Calvary.
The Red Army's revenge. The punishment against the Germans at the hands of those who had suffered years of occupation and repression reached levels of unleashed violence. Such was the thirst for revenge among Polish ranks that it had even provoked concern within the Soviet apparatus. General Ivan Serov, head of the NKVD assigned to the First Belarusian Front, sent a report to Lavrenti Beria warning that the behavior of Polish troops was seriously hindering military intelligence work. According to his report, soldiers of the First Polish Army treated German prisoners with uncontrolled brutality. In many cases, those captured never reached the designated holding areas. One of the most extreme examples occurred in the sector of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division. There, 80 Germans were captured alive, but only 2 reached the facilities intended for prisoners. The rest were summarily executed along the way. The massacre wasn't limited to impulsive acts in the heat of battle. Even after preliminary interrogations, when the prisoners were being taken to the intelligence officer for formal questioning, they were shot before arriving. This pattern was not an isolated case, but part of a relentless cycle of collective punishment. For the Poles, who had seen their cities destroyed and their population massacred by the Germans, there was no room for forgiveness, only violence as a response to years of horror. The resurgence of horror, the brutal torture suffered by the German people. On the Eastern Front, the fury of the Red Army swept away everything in its path. From Königsberg to Vienna, the Soviet troops advanced intoxicated by a mixture of victory, revenge, and hatred. For millions of Soviet soldiers, this was a campaign of personal justice, a retaliation for the razed villages, murdered brothers, and cities burned by the Wehrmacht. But that justice soon turned into indiscriminate cruelty. The mass rapes were not limited to Berlin. They occurred in nearly every German city and village occupied by the Soviets. In Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia, atrocities were recorded that today are barely mentioned in school textbooks. In many villages, not a single woman remained unviolated. Several renowned historians have claimed that collective rape became a symbolic and systematic punishment. It was such a widespread phenomenon that even high-ranking Soviet commanders privately acknowledged the severity of the situation. Nevertheless, the political leadership in Moscow allowed it. Stalin's conquest over the Third Reich had to be imprinted on the bodies of its citizens. But it wasn't only women who suffered. In many cases, German civilian men, elderly and teenagers alike, were summarily executed without trial. Other times they were deported eastward to forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. Many of them would never return. Children also did not escape the brutality. Some were killed alongside their parents, and others who had been orphaned during the war or after the occupation were abandoned in orphanages without identity or homeland. Families were dissolved between columns of smoke and columns of soldiers. In East Prussia, hell took the form of an exodus. Coastal cities like Pillau and Danzig filled with refugees trying to board ships heading west, fleeing from the Red Army. But many did not succeed. Trains were bombed, ships were sunk, roads were blocked by ice or corpses. Some froze to death. Others were shot by Soviet soldiers. Those who survived did so with mutilated souls. Occupation in the West. In the West, the Allied occupation was different, and although it is often portrayed as a more civilized process, it was not free from violence. The American, British, and French forces found a country in ruins, although the treatment was less brutal than in the East. Revenge was not absent. Internment camps were established for Germans accused of collaboration or mere Nazi sympathy. In many cases, without trial or evidence, they were denied food, medical assistance, and human dignity. One of the darkest episodes was that of the Rheinwiesenlager camps, which we will discuss later. In France, the situation was even more humiliating for some Germans. Colonial troops from sub-Saharan Africa, integrated into the French army, were deliberately deployed in German areas to punish the population. Numerous testimonies collected by the Red Cross and war correspondents describe rapes, looting, and abuse. In Stuttgart and other cities, hundreds of women were attacked. The French authorities rarely intervened. The Allied doctrine assumed that the German people had to be re-educated from scratch. This included press censorship, school indoctrination, and the removal of symbols. But it also meant collective humiliation. German children were forced to watch films about the concentration camps. Entire populations were forced to bury the corpses of the Holocaust victims. All of this was aimed at instilling a perpetual sense of guilt. But the line between justice and revenge is fragile. In many towns in southern Germany, American soldiers organized forced parades of civilians past mass graves. In others, they placed signs that read, "Here died the true Germans." The psychology of the defeated was not rebuilt, it was demolished. Women who had been raped found no understanding. They were stigmatized, called collaborators, or simply ignored by their neighbors. Many fell into silence, unable to verbalize the trauma. Men who returned from the front or from the camps found neither home nor honor. They were ghosts in a country in ruins. And yet the machinery of revenge did not stop, because beyond the decisions of governments, rage was embedded in the hearts of the peoples. The post-war violence was the dark echo of Nazi violence, a repetition without redemption. Across the continent, Germans were now the universal enemy. Even those who had been persecuted by the Nazis, even the children born in 1945. The notion of justice became confused with that of collective punishment. What began as liberation ended for many as a perpetual condemnation. The Rheinwiesenlager, the Allied camps in occupied Germany. Along the Rhine River, between April and September 1945, the Western Allies, primarily under American command, established a network of internment camps known as the Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine meadow camps. More than 1 million unarmed German soldiers, mostly young recruits, elderly men mobilized in the final stages of the conflict, and simple auxiliaries were gathered in these improvised enclosures. The term used by the Allied authorities to classify them was deliberately ambiguous. Disarmed enemy forces, a category that excluded them from the protection granted by the Geneva Convention to prisoners of war. Without that legal protection, the prisoners became non-persons. They were defeated fighters, treated like human garbage. The camps were nothing more than open fields enclosed with barbed wire. There were no barracks, no latrines, no kitchens. There was no shelter from the rain or sun. In some camps, like Remagen, Sinzig, Andernach, or Bingen, up to 200,000 men were crammed together in inhumane conditions. Food rations were scarce. Sometimes a single piece of bread had to be shared among 4 or 5 people. The water, when available, came from contaminated rivers. The sick died without medical attention. Bodies were thrown into mass graves dug by the prisoners themselves. Many tried to survive by digging holes in the ground to shelter from the cold or the rain. Diarrhea, typhus, and malnutrition wreaked havoc. The International Red Cross was denied access to these camps for months, and German humanitarian organizations were banned. Information was censored. Cameras were forbidden. The world was to believe that the war had ended and justice prevailed. The exact number of deaths remains a subject of debate. Official American sources acknowledged more than 3,000 documented deaths, but later investigations, such as those by Canadian journalist James Back, estimated that between 50,000 and 90,000 prisoners may have died in these camps due to deliberately negligent conditions. Back, in his controversial book, Other Losses, accused General Dwight Eisenhower of designing a systematic policy of slow extermination through starvation and exposure. Although many historians have questioned Back's exact numbers, few deny the scale of the suffering. American war correspondent Marguerite Higgins, after visiting the Andernach camp, wrote, "I saw young men with sunken eyes, covered in mud, too weak to stand. They crawled like animals, without hope. One of them was only 15 years old. He had lost 20 kilos in 3 weeks. In the Andernach camp, a young German woman named Erika, who lived near the perimeter, reported that village women tried to throw bread over the fences, only to see American guards stomp on it or throw it back with insults. According to her testimony, they were not Nazis. They were not criminals. They were our brothers, our fathers, our sons. They were treated like vermin. German women who tried to help the prisoners were sometimes arrested for collaboration with the enemy. No one was to show compassion for the defeated. Collective punishment was part of the new moral order. In some cases, even African American soldiers designated as guards were ordered to treat the prisoners especially harshly. The symbolism was no accident. It was about inverting the racial narrative of Nazi.
Many returned to towns already destroyed or emptied, to families dead or missing. Some never spoke again of what they had lived through. Others died in the years that followed, unable to rebuild a life on the foundations of hatred and humiliation. Silence was the final shroud. In the official history of World War II, the Rodonivier occupy a page. The victorious narrative prefers to remember the crimes of Nazism, but not the punishments without trial suffered by the defeated. Documents about these camps remained classified for decades. Only over time did they begin to surface, brought to light by independent historians and testimonies rescued from oblivion.
Flight and expulsion, the forced exodus of the German people. The year 1945 did not only mark the end of the war, it also marked the end of a millennia-old history, that of the Germans settled in Eastern Europe in territories such as East Prussia, Silesia, the Sudetenland, and regions of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and the Balkans. A presence that in some cases dated back to the Holy Roman Empire vanished almost overnight, erased by revenge, politics, and chaos. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans, known as Volkdeutsch, or simply the displaced, were expelled from their homes between 1945 and 1950. The process was not an orderly evacuation, much less a voluntary migration. It was a covert ethnic cleansing, justified under the logic of collective punishment. The order was not improvised. It was discussed at Yalta and formalized at the Potsdam Conference, where the victorious powers agreed on what was supposed to be the orderly and humane transfer of German populations outside the new borders of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other neighboring countries. But nothing was orderly, and certainly nothing was humane. In East Prussia, the winter of 1944 to 1945 became the scene of an apocalyptic exodus. Fleeing the Red Army, millions of German civilians abandoned their towns in the midst of ice, snow, and fire. Wagon caravans became easy targets for Soviet planes. Refugee columns made up of women, the elderly, and children marched between corpses, some frozen standing like tragic statues along the road. A young refugee wrote in her diary, "We walked over bodies. Some children cried from hunger. Others didn't cry anymore. They had surrendered to the silence of death." The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. One of the first signs of the catastrophe to come was the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, torpedoed by a Soviet submarine in the Baltic Sea. It became the deadliest maritime disaster in history, with over 9,000 deaths, mostly German civilians fleeing the Red Advance. Other ships, such as the Goya and the Stroben, suffered the same fate. The sea became the tomb of a wandering nation. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff is considered by many experts to be the prelude to the great genocide that Germans and other Eastern Europeans would suffer at the hands of the Soviets after the fall of the Reich. In the freezing month of January 1945, tens of thousands of German civilians tried to escape via the Baltic Sea in what was called Operation Hannibal, a massive naval evacuation organized by the Wehrmacht. Not out of altruism, but out of desperation. The Red Army's advance was unstoppable, and the atrocities committed in East Prussia instilled paralyzing fear. Among the evacuation ships was the Wilhelm Gustloff, originally built as a cruise ship under the Nazi Strength Through Joy program. It was later converted into a hospital ship and then a troop transport. On January 30th, 1945. It departed from the port of Gottenhofen. Absurdly overloaded. Designed to carry 1,800 people, it held more than 10,000 passengers that night, including wounded soldiers and naval personnel, but above all, civilians, women, children, and newborns. The temperature was -8 degrees Celsius. The sea was particularly rough and treacherous, and the routes were infested with Soviet submarines. At 9:16 p.m., less than 30 kilometers from the coast, the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko, detected the ship on its radar and without hesitation fired 3 torpedoes. All struck. The first hit the bow, the second struck the cabins of the refugee women, and the third destroyed the engine room. The Gustloff lost power and sank in less than 50 minutes. There was no time to save almost anyone. The lifeboats were scarce and the decks were slippery. Many died in the explosion. Others were crushed in the stampede caused by panic. Thousands fell into the sea and froze to death within minutes. Rescue ships managed to save around 1,200 survivors, but over 9,000 people died in what is still remembered as the greatest maritime tragedy in human history, even greater than the Titanic. Yet the world barely remembers it. As with many abuses and war crimes committed by the Allies during those days, it didn't fit the narrative of victors and vanquished. Some bodies continued to appear months later, washed ashore by the waves, clutching frozen dolls in their arms, or embracing already dead siblings. Others were never recovered. They became part of the sea. The Gustloff is today a forgotten wreck, a sunken cemetery of silence, a symbol of how war kept killing even after surrender was signed. Post-war purges. But as mentioned, the events of January 1945 were just the beginning of the humanitarian disaster. After the official end of the conflict, expulsions intensified in Poland. Germans were torn from their homes, their lands confiscated, their villages renamed. In many cases, they were locked in transit camps where they died from malnutrition, typhus, or beatings. In Czechoslovakia, the Beneš decrees legalized expropriation and total dispossession of property. Hundreds of thousands of Germans were also stripped of their citizenship, their property, and their civil rights. In some towns, they were marked with white armbands or spat on in public squares before being forced to leave. The trains used during the expulsions were no different from the Nazi extermination trains. Overcrowded wagons, no water, no food, no clear destination. Those who survived the journey arrived in a ruined Germany where they were not received as victims, but rather seen as an unwelcome burden. In Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia, the same pattern was repeated. The Volksdeutsch were stripped of everything. Thousands were deported to forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. In Yugoslavia, under Tito's regime, tens of thousands were executed or died in camps, such as Dachau and Kinanin, where the mortality rate reached 30%. They were accused of treason, collaboration, and fascism, although many had never had any connection to the Nazi regime. The numbers are staggering, between 500,000 and 2 million deaths, depending on the source, among the victims of expulsion and exodus. The most conservative historians estimate at least 600,000 lives lost. But beyond the numbers lies the invisible tragedy, the loss of a world. Entire villages disappeared. Centuries-old Lutheran churches were closed. Unique dialects were forgotten. The invisible threads that linked generations were severed. In many regions of Central Europe, the traces of German culture were erased, as if they had never existed. The Soviets didn't just want to expel the Germans, they wanted to eradicate their history and culture. New generations grew up without knowing what had happened. the victims were silenced by the official narrative of good versus evil, and the word shame became a burden shared by all Germans without distinction between guilty and innocent. In post-war Germany, the displaced became known as Heimatvertriebene, the banished from their homeland. They were housed in ruins, barns, and abandoned barracks. Some were rejected by West Germans themselves, who saw them as Eastern barbarians. Others hid their origins, their accents, their pain. For years, their tragedy was a taboo. Only decades later, with Reconstruction and reunification, did Germany begin to acknowledge the suffering of these millions of stateless souls. Monuments were erected, commemorations organized, but memory came too late. Many had already died.
Fluchtjung was not just a post-war episode. It was a demographic purge with cultural, psychological, and moral implications. It was the punishment of the living for the crimes of the dead. And it was also the final chapter of a plural Germany, one that extended beyond the Elbe River, whose traces today survive only in forgotten gravestones and names erased from maps.
The Fury of Liberation, Czechoslovakia. The Fury of Liberation, executions of German civilians in Czechoslovakia. In May 1945, while the bells rang in Prague to celebrate the end of the war, another kind of war was beginning in the streets, villages, and fields of the Czechoslovak interior. A war without fronts, without uniforms, without rules. An unleashed vengeance. For 6 years, the Germans had occupied Czechoslovakia with brutal efficiency. Now the pendulum swung with equal violence, but in the opposite direction. It was no longer about justice. It was about expelling, humiliating, annihilating. The order was clear. The German had to disappear. The retreat of the Nazi troops left the ethnic Germans of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetendeutsche, at the mercy of popular rage. There were about 3 million people who had lived for generations in the Sudetenland, and who were now considered traitors, internal enemies, remnants of a criminal regime. The Czech press called them German beasts. Political leaders spoke of a necessary cleansing, and the population, which had been abused, wounded, and humiliated for years, became the executioners of their former captives. One of the darkest episodes took place in the city of Ústí nad Labem on July 31, 1945. A mysterious explosion in a munitions depot served as a pretext for a brutal pogrom against the local German community. Czech authorities claimed, without evidence, that it was a German act of sabotage. In response, mobs armed with sticks, knives, and rifles took to the streets and hunted Germans like animals. More than 80 people were publicly murdered, some thrown alive into the Ella River. Another scene of horror occurred in Postoloprati, a small town in the north of the country. In June 1945, more than 700 German civilians, mostly men and teenagers, were arrested and executed on the outskirts of the village by Czech militias, without charges or fair trial, solely due to popular revenge. The bodies were buried in mass graves. For decades, the episode was officially denied, until excavations in the 2000s confirmed the testimonies. In Brno, the capital of Moravia, one of the most cruel death marches of the period took place. On the night of May 30, 1945, more than 20,000 Germans, mostly women, elderly people, and children, were expelled from the city on foot, under armed guard, toward the Austrian border. They were not allowed to take more than they could carry. The march occurred under extreme heat, without water or food. Between 1,500 and 5,000 people died along the way, or in the improvised concentration camps established in the following days. A Czech nurse who witnessed the scene wrote, "I saw how they forced a woman to leave her baby at the side of the road. She could no longer carry him. She begged. She cried. No one helped her. The massacres were repeated throughout the country. In Zatek, Chomutov, Luni, and Kalovari, people's militias, often supported by local authorities or members of the Communist Party, executed hundreds of Germans without distinction of age or gender. Some were forced to walk over deactivated mines. Others were publicly tortured or raped in groups. Women were often stripped naked, had their heads shaved, marked with swastikas, raped, and then murdered. Everything happened in broad daylight, sometimes with the applause of neighbors, and at other times with the terrifying silence of those who knew they would be next. President Edward Beneš, leader of the Czechoslovak government in exile during the war, not only tolerated this violence, but even legitimized it through the Beneš decrees, signed between 1945 and 1946. The expulsion of Germans was authorized, and the total expropriation of their property justified, along with the automatic loss of their citizenship. Any past sympathy with the Nazi regime, real or presumed, was enough to lose everything. The executions and humiliations were not accidents or spontaneous excesses. They were part of a systematic process driven by the narrative of national justice. The objective was not to punish the guilty, but to eliminate the German presence from Czechoslovak territory forever. The national press spoke of purification, moral hygiene, and historical reparation. But what was happening in the streets was ethnic lynching. Over the years, the few survivors who managed to escape alive remained silent or immigrated. The graves were hidden, the crimes silenced, and the official Czechoslovak history was written without those pages. Only decades later, with the opening of archives and the testimonies of aging witnesses, did the other side of liberation begin to emerge. Stone upon stone, the aerial annihilation, the bombings of Hamburg, and the aerial annihilation of Germany. By the spring of 1945, the war was already lost for Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing from within. The Red Army was encircling Berlin. American and British troops were crossing the Rhine. Hitler was hiding in his bunker. And yet from the sky, the destruction did not stop. The Luftwaffe lay in ruins. The German air defense was dismantled. But Allied formations continued to arrive night after night, day after day. The British four-engine Lancaster and Halifax bombers, along with the American B-17s and B-24s, dropped thousands of tons of bombs on open cities, on working-class neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, churches, train stations, and air raid shelters. This was not a mistake, but an insidious strategy. Since 1942, the Allies had adopted a doctrine known as moral bombing, conceived by figures such as Arthur Harris, commander of the British Bomber Command. The theory was simple and brutal: to sow terror among the civilian population, to break morale, to destroy any capacity for resistance, even spiritual. In 1943, Hamburg had already been the victim of the infamous Operation Gomorrah, a series of attacks that left more than 35,000 dead and reduced entire neighborhoods to dust. But in 1945, when everything was already lost, the bombings returned, this time with no need to use military or strategic targets as a pretext. It was pure and hard punishment. On April 8, 1945, a wave of more than 500 British bombers flew over Hamburg, dropping more than 3,000 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs. The goal was to accelerate the collapse. What they left behind was a ghost town, a smoking crater on the remains of a metropolis that years before had been a symbol of German trade and culture. The bombs did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. They fell on hospitals full of wounded, on nursing homes or improvised shelters where children slept on the floor. The incendiary bombs caused firestorms fueled by oxygen sucked from the basements. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. The asphalt melted. People burned alive or suffocated upon opening the shelter door and breathing in the overheated air. More than 20,000 people died in Hamburg in the bombings of March and April 1945 alone. Most were civilians. Many were elderly, women, and children. Others were Allied prisoners of war or German refugees fleeing from the East. Ironically, many of the dead were neither Nazis nor soldiers, but victims of the regime's own crimes, now paying with their lives. But Hamburg was not the only one. Dresden, Würzburg, Pforzheim, Kassel, Hildesheim, Leipzig, Potsdam, and dozens of other smaller cities were wiped off the map. On February 13, 1945, Dresden, a city with no direct military importance, no large factories or troop concentrations, was attacked by more than 1,200 planes. The incendiary bombs turned the Baroque center town into an oven. Between 25,000 and 35,000 people died in a single night. The vast majority were refugees and unarmed civilians. The bodies were charred, unrecognizable, piled in open squares before being buried in mass graves. In Pforzheim, on February 23, 1945, in just 20 minutes, more than 17,000 people died. The city had 65,000 inhabitants. It was one of the highest destruction rates of the entire war. Some attacks were even carried out after the de facto surrender of German troops in certain regions, when there was no longer any strategic threat. The purpose then seemed definitive psychological demolition, the total elimination of any vestige of pride, culture, or humanity in the heart of Germany. In many cases, Allied intelligence reports acknowledged that the targets were minimal or of no tactical importance, but the bombing machinery continued operating with routine, almost administrative brutality. And although many Allied citizens were unaware of the details of these bombings, others celebrated them as deserved retribution.
The press spoke of reducing the Nazi layer to rubble, while the images that reached the public, if they reached, showed only ruins without names, without screams. The horror was recorded in the memory of survivors, in photographs taken in secret, in stories recovered decades later. Hamburg was turned into a desert of charred bricks, its churches carbonized, its hospitals crushed, its streets unrecognizable. Those who emerged from the shelters saw a dead city. But beyond the physical destruction, the total bombing campaign was an act of cultural and emotional extermination. Bodies died, but so did stories, families, memories, libraries, museums, entire generations of identity. At the end of the war, not all crimes were judged. Some remained cloaked in the smoke of victory. But the ashes of Hamburg, of Dresden, of so many German cities, still speak. Their dead do not scream. They burn in silence. The collapse of Demmin. A city chooses death. The collapse of Demmin. The tragic story of the city that chose to die. In the spring of 1945, on the banks of the Peene River, the small German town of Demmin became the scene of one of the most tragic and least known acts at the end of World War II. As the forces of the Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east, destroying everything in their path, Demmin awaited its fate in dread. News spread like wildfire. Stories of rapes, murders, looting, and mutilations arrived from neighboring villages. No one knew for sure what was real and what was rumor, but fear had taken deep root. The town was practically defenseless. The Wehrmacht had withdrawn, blowing up the bridges that crossed the Peene during their retreat in an attempt to slow the Soviet advance. All they left behind were terrified civilians, elderly people, women, children, and the echo of what was coming. On April 30th, 1945, the Red Army entered Demmin. Just hours later, the first houses were burning. Mass looting, systematic rapes, beatings, and summary executions were reported. The soldiers went door to door,
armed not only with rifles, but with the absolute power of those who have triumphed and fear no retribution. For the inhabitants of Demmin, hell was not a religious symbol. It had become concrete and real. It was in the streets, at the doorsteps of their homes. Faced with the horror unfolding before their eyes, and what they still feared might come, hundreds of families made a desperate decision to end everything. They did it in every possible way. The Peene became a grim stage. Mothers with their children tied to their bodies threw themselves into its waters. Some made sure the little ones could not float by tying stones around their necks. On the banks, Soviet soldiers watched. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they shot. But generally, they simply let it happen. Official documents recorded at least 900 deaths, but historians estimate that the real number exceeds 1,200. In a town of just 15,000 inhabitants, almost a tenth of the population disappeared within days. Churches became improvised morgues. Basements turned into homemade gas chambers. The silence that followed the events was as deafening as the roar of horror. It was not a mass collapse. It was induced by fear and the certainty of defeat, amplified by the brutal conduct of the Red Army and the previous propaganda that for years had portrayed the enemy as a soulless beast. The mass death in Demmin was so dramatic, so inhuman, that even some Soviet officers, survivors of Stalingrad, and accustomed to destruction and the most inhumane acts, were shocked. But no orders were given to stop it. No barriers were built on the river, and no one was helped. German life, at least at that moment, had no value. Some residents survived purely by chance, because they were found by a less cruel soldier, because they hid better, because they failed in their attempt to kill themselves. Many of them carried the guilt of having survived for decades. The town, for its part, remained silent. Talking about Demmin became taboo. During the German Democratic Republic, the topic was deliberately ignored. It did not fit the heroic narrative of the Red Army as liberators. There was no room for compassion toward Germans. And in the West, the story faded among so many other tragedies. But the testimonies endure, and the tombstones in the Demmin cemetery, many without names, without dates, without crosses, still remember those who did not want to see the dawn of a new Germany. Those who, after years of war, chose to die on the banks of their own country rather than live under the boot of victory.
The erasure of German identity. The memory of the enemy. The destruction of German identity and culture after the war. Despite the end of the war, the struggle continued on another level, the symbolic one, where the cultural battle was fought. It was no longer about conquering cities, but about erasing what those cities represented. It was no longer armies being destroyed, but memories, roots, culture. German identity was condemned to suspicion and punishment, not only for the crimes of National Socialism, but for the mere fact of existing in many regions occupied by the victors. Everything German was criminalized in its very essence, and thus began the cultural cleansing, the purge of books, symbols, films, or any artifact related to German identity. Where once imperial flags or regional banners had flown, foreign flags were now raised. Cities changed names. Königsberg became Kaliningrad. Breslau was now Ruck-War. The German language was banned from the public sphere. Signs, books, documents, and even tombstones were replaced or destroyed. Book burnings were not only a Nazi practice. In Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and other territories, entire libraries were incinerated, German schools were closed, and cultural archives were looted or disappeared. German literature, music, and art were considered toxic residues of the past. A 1946 report from the Czech government detailed the destruction of more than 2 million German books in Bohemia and Moravia, as they were seen as instruments of German propaganda. Many of them were not political works, but classical literature, philosophical treatises, local histories, poetry. Everything spoken in the language of the defeated was reduced to ashes. Churches were desecrated. Hundreds of monuments were blown up or torn down in public celebrations, and cemeteries of German families were destroyed, or worse, looted. Crosses were torn down, tombstones used as building materials, and human remains desecrated or scattered. In many Polish villages, the bones of German soldiers or civilians were exhumed and thrown into anonymous mass graves. Memory was erased along with the marble. In the Sudetenland, dozens of German Catholic parishes, some dating back to the 14th century, were burned or converted into stables, warehouses, or military installations. Religious images were decapitated. Bells, masterpieces of artisanal blacksmithing, were melted down. Church organs, considered magnificent works of wood and metal, crafted by the finest luthiers, were silenced, and in some cases, destroyed. In cities like Rokwar or Gdansk, German monuments were systematically eliminated, not for tactical reasons, but ideological ones. The goal was not to build a new nation, but to erase the trace of the previous one. And in the area controlled by the Soviet Union, the process was even more radical. Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg, birthplace of philosophers like Immanuel Kant, was repopulated by Russians and Ukrainians. The German language disappeared within weeks. The castle of the Prussian dukes was demolished in 1968, not for structural reasons, but because it was considered an imperialist symbol.